What if you found out at 16 years old that the woman you called mom wasn't your mother at all? What if the man who raised you, who taught you to ride a bike and helped with your homework, had actually taken you from your real family when you were only 5 and told you a lie you believed for over a decade? These aren't hypothetical questions. They're the real lives of the 5 people you're about to meet. Children who were taken, hidden, and raised under identities that weren't their own, and who only found the truth by accident, by chance, or by pure stubborn refusal to stop asking questions. Every one of these cases starts the same way. A family shattered in an instant, with no note, no explanation, and no way of knowing whether the missing person was ever coming back. But it's what happens next that makes these stories so hard to look away from. Some of these children were raised with love by people who had no right to raise them. Some built entire new lives under names that weren't theirs, only to have those names catch up with them decades later. One of these cases became a national headline that split public opinion right down the middle, with millions of strangers arguing online about who the real victim actually was. Another ends with a family finally getting their answer, a full 44 years too late to do anything about it. Let's get into all 5 of these cases, one at a time, starting with the one that almost single-handedly broke the internet. Story 1, Julian Hernandez. Julian Hernandez was, by every measure, a model teenager, a senior in high school, an excellent student, involved in a long list of extracurricular activities, with his sights set firmly on college. He had the kind of transcript parents dream of: straight A's, strong test scores, a resume of clubs and volunteer work built over years of consistent effort. Life was going exactly according to plan until he sat down to fill out his college applications. One by one, his applications came back denied. Not because of his grades or his test scores, but because of something far stranger: a discrepancy between his name and his social security number. Confused and increasingly anxious, Julian brought the problem to his school guidance counselor, hoping they could help him track down the source of the error and get his paperwork sorted out before deadlines passed. What they uncovered instead would unravel everything Julian thought he knew about his own life. Digging into the records, they discovered that a boy matching Julian's identity had been reported missing 15 years earlier. Julian had spent his entire life completely unaware that he was, technically, a missing person, living under an identity that had been carefully constructed to erase his real past. Shaken and desperate for answers, Julian confronted the one person who might actually know the truth: his father, Bobby Hernandez. Bobby tried to dodge the questions at first, stumbling over his words, clearly hoping to avoid the conversation altogether. But eventually, cornered by his son's persistence, he admitted it. Everything Julian had been told about his life, his name, his history, even the story of what happened to his mother, had been a lie. Overwhelmed and unsure what to do next, Julian did something that would end up putting his story in front of millions of strangers. He posted the entire situation on Reddit, laying out what he'd just learned and asking for legal advice. In his post, he explained that his father had changed both of their names and social security numbers, essentially erasing their old identities to stay hidden from the law. He talked about how his entire sense of self had just been rebuilt from the ground up in the span of a single conversation. He even recalled a strange memory from childhood, his father once asking him, seemingly out of nowhere, whether he would still love him if he found out something terrible that he'd done. So, why exactly would a father kidnap his own son? The story traced back to 2002, when Bobby and Julian's mother were in the middle of a bitter custody battle, the kind of drawn-out legal fight that leaves both parents feeling like they've lost something, no matter which way the ruling goes. The court ultimately sided with Julian's mother, awarding her full custody of 5-year-old Julian. Sometime after that ruling, Bobby asked his ex-wife if he could babysit Julian after kindergarten one day. She agreed. When she came home that evening, both Julian and Bobby were gone. All she found was a note, left behind by Bobby, explaining that he intended to take Julian away for good. Bobby fled with Julian all the way to Cleveland, Ohio, where he built an entirely new life with a girlfriend and her children, blending into a household that, from the outside, looked completely normal. New name, new school records, new social security number. Every detail meticulously rebuilt so nobody would ever ask questions. For 13 years, Julian grew up believing this fabricated version of his life was simply the truth. Whenever he asked about his mother, his father told him she was gone forever. A devastating lie that shaped how Julian understood his own family for over a decade. He grew up thinking he was unwanted by half of his own bloodline, when in reality, his mother had spent every single one of those 13 years desperately searching for him. When Julian's Reddit post went viral, it triggered a fierce debate online, one that honestly still hasn't settled. A huge portion of the reaction focused surprisingly not on Bobby, but on Julian's mother. Some commenters described her as naive, even careless, for having agreed to let Bobby babysit their son unsupervised in the first place. That framing set off its own smaller firestorm, with just as many people pushing back hard, arguing it was deeply unfair to call a mother gullible for trusting her own child's father with an afternoon of babysitting. Nobody, they argued, agrees to hand over their 5-year-old expecting it to be the last time they'll see them for 13 years. That single detail of the story, who deserves the blame when trust is the thing that gets exploited, is arguably what made this case spread as far as it did. Separately, plenty of others sympathized to some degree with Bobby himself, pointing out that he had clearly worked hard to give his son a stable, loving home despite the deception, holding down a job, building a family, raising a straight-A student. Others pushed back hard on that framing too, arguing that people should remember there are always two sides to a story, and that a man capable of kidnapping his own child and lying to him for 13 years was unlikely to be the St. Julian believed him to be. It's a debate that, to this day, still divides people whenever this case comes up. Is it possible to separate a genuinely loving upbringing from the fact that it was built entirely on a crime? Eventually, Julian's school counselor alerted the police, and word reached his biological mother that her son may have finally been found. She'd been through false leads before, so she braced herself for disappointment. But this time, it was real. When investigators confirmed it truly was Julian, she was overwhelmed with relief after 15 years of uncertainty. Bobby Hernandez was arrested in November of 2015. His trial drew significant media attention, in large part because of how unusual the circumstances were. The victim was now an adult, had suffered no physical abuse under his father's care, and stood firmly by his father's side throughout the proceedings, publicly asking the jury to show him leniency. Prosecutors were left in the strange position of building a case around a kidnapping the alleged victim didn't want prosecuted, while still needing to prove, for the sake of the law and for Julian's mother, that what Bobby did constituted a serious crime, regardless of how the relationship had turned out. Despite Julian's pleas, the jury found Bobby guilty of abduction, custodial interference, and forgery of documents. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. As for Julian's mother, she had never given up hope, even after 15 years of dead ends and heartbreak. That unwavering faith was finally rewarded. Over the holidays, following the discovery, mother and son were reunited for the first time in over a decade, sharing an emotional, tearful reunion that neither of them had ever stopped hoping for. Julian's case forces you to ask an uncomfortable question about where love ends and crime begins, and whether a childhood built on a lie can still be called a good childhood. Our next case takes that same question and turns it into one of the most talked about kidnapping cases in American history. Because this time, the child, it wasn't just hidden. She was raised for 18 years without ever knowing her name wasn't really her own. Story 2. Camilla Mobley. On the 10th of July, 1998, a 16-year-old girl named Shannara Mobley gave birth to a healthy baby girl in a Jacksonville, Florida hospital. She named her daughter Camilla. Despite her young age and difficult circumstances, Shannara saw her daughter's birth as a turning point, a reason to finally get her life on track. Not long after the birth, a woman dressed in medical scrubs walked into Shannara's hospital room, introducing herself as a nurse. She wasn't. Behind the friendly introduction was a woman in a deep personal crisis, trapped in an abusive relationship, stripped of custody of her own children, and still reeling both physically and emotionally from a recent miscarriage. Overwhelmed with grief and postpartum depression, she had driven to the hospital that day, stood outside the nursery staring at the newborns, and then walked directly into Shannara's room. For hours, this woman stayed by Shannara's side, offering comfort and support, all under the false identity of a hospital nurse. Eventually, she told Shannara it was time to take the baby to check her temperature. Instead, she placed baby Camilla into a leather bag, walked calmly out of the hospital, and disappeared. Shannara was left frantic, desperately calling out for her missing daughter. Within hours, the case exploded into a full-scale investigation. Hospital security footage was pulled, staff were questioned, and police worked with Shannara and other witnesses to build a composite sketch of the mystery woman who had posed as a nurse. The story made national news almost immediately. A newborn, stolen in broad daylight from inside a hospital, by someone calm and confident enough to walk straight out the front door with her. Tips poured in from around the country, and for a while, hope stayed high that Camilla would be found within days. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into years. The composite sketch never led anywhere solid, and as the case aged, it slowly slipped from the headlines into the much colder category of an unsolved abduction. Camilla's abduction became a mystery with no leads, no suspects, and no answers for 18 years. Following a lawsuit against the hospital for its negligence in allowing someone to simply walk in and take a newborn, Shannara was eventually awarded $1.5 million in a settlement. But no amount of money could tell her what had actually happened to her daughter, or whether she was even still alive. Every birthday, every missed milestone, became its own quiet reminder that somewhere out there, a stranger might be raising her little girl as their own. The woman responsible for the kidnapping was named Gloria Williams. In the years that followed, Gloria managed to leave her abusive relationship, regain custody of her own children, remarry, and raise Camilla as her own, under a brand new name, Alexis Manigault. Growing up in South Carolina, Alexis had what looked like a genuinely happy childhood. She had friends, she had siblings, she went to school, she had a normal life in every visible way. But at 16, she stumbled onto something that didn't add up. She had no social security number, which meant she couldn't get a driver's license or apply for jobs like everyone else her age. Something clearly wasn't right, and Alexis eventually confronted the woman she'd always believed was her mother. Gloria admitted the truth. She had stolen Alexis away as a newborn. Even after hearing this, and even when Gloria offered to turn herself in, Alexis refused. Whatever the truth of her origins, she wasn't ready to lose the only mother she had ever known. Imagine being 16 and having to make that decision in the span of a single conversation, knowing that the woman who raised you, who you love unconditionally, built your entire existence on a crime committed against a stranger you've never met. Alexis chose loyalty to the only life she'd ever known, and for another year, she carried that secret entirely on her own. The case finally broke open in January of 2017, when the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children received 2 anonymous tips pointing investigators toward Walterboro, South Carolina. One tip came from a friend Alexis had confided in. The other came from someone who'd overheard Alexis talking about Gloria not actually being her biological mother. When police confronted Gloria and requested a DNA test, the results confirmed it beyond any doubt. Alexis Manigault was Camilla Mobley, the baby who had vanished from a Florida hospital 18 years earlier. The news detonated across national media within hours. This wasn't just a missing persons case closing after nearly 2 decades. It was one of the longest unsolved infant abductions in American history finally being solved. And it reignited a debate that had simmered in true crime circles for years about how a stolen child could grow into an adult who genuinely loved her abductor. Reporters camped outside the family's homes on both sides. Talk shows debated the ethics of the case for weeks. And at the center of all of it was a young woman who suddenly had 2 full names, 2 mothers, and 2 completely different versions of the first 18 years of her life to reconcile. When Shannara received the news, she was overwhelmed with joy. Even though she had gone on to have other children in the years since, her firstborn had never left her thoughts. But the reunion wasn't the simple, joyful moment she had spent nearly 2 decades imagining. For Camilla, who had spent her entire conscious life as Alexis, Gloria Williams was, in every meaningful sense, her real mother. In February of 2018, Gloria pleaded guilty to kidnapping and interfering with custody. During her trial, Shannara testified about the overwhelming grief she carried after her newborn was taken from her. Grief that never fully resolved, even once she learned her daughter was alive and thriving, because the daughter she found wasn't quite the one she'd spent 18 years imagining. Gloria, for her part, expressed remorse, but it wasn't enough to sway the sentence. She was found guilty and sentenced to 18 years in prison. A strange kind of symmetry, given that was almost exactly how long Kamaya had spent not knowing who she really was. Even after everything that came out in court, Kamia has refused to cut ties with the woman who raised her. In an interview conducted 20 years after the kidnapping, Shannara revealed a painful postscript to the story. She and Kamia were, at that point, no longer speaking. A story that should have ended in a perfect reunion instead left behind a far more complicated, far more human outcome. Two mothers, one truth, and a daughter caught permanently in between. Kamia's story is about a stolen identity built on a lie of love, a crime that somehow produced a genuinely happy childhood for the victim, which is exactly why the case still divides people who hear it. Our next case is something colder. No love, no adoptive family, just a woman who vanished after her employer allegedly threatened her life, leaving behind a trail of suspicion that took 17 years to untangle. Story 3. Denise Bolzer. On January 17, 1985, 24-year-old Denise Desrousseaux Bolzer vanished from her home in Raymond, New Hampshire. When her husband got home that day, it took him a full 6 hours to even notice something was wrong. A strange, unsettling note pinned to their refrigerator that simply read, "We've got your wife." When police arrived to investigate, all they found were footprints in the snow leading away from the house. No demand for ransom ever came. No one ever tried to make contact. The note offered no real clues about who had written it or why. Investigators eventually traced a lead to Logan Airport, where they found her husband's pickup truck abandoned in a parking lot. Sitting on the front seat, almost deliberately placed, were Denise's social security card, her birth certificate, and her credit cards. But there was no sign of Denise herself. The placement of those documents bothered investigators. It looked less like something a random abductor would bother doing, and much more like someone trying to send a message, or trying to make sure Denise could never be traced through any of her usual paper trail. With virtually nothing to go on, investigators hit a wall. Denise's family, who described themselves as extremely close with her, suspected something sinister had happened and pushed hard for the case to be treated as a potential abduction rather than a voluntary disappearance. Her husband, however, was never seriously considered a suspect, and he went on to file for divorce as the case dragged on without resolution, quietly moving on with his own life while Denise's family kept pushing for answers year after year. A few months after Denise disappeared, a new piece of the puzzle surfaced. The courier service where she had worked as a bookkeeper accused her of embezzling somewhere between $12,000 and a staggering $100,000. This opened up an entirely different theory. Maybe Denise hadn't been taken at all. Maybe she had run to escape the consequences of her own actions. It was a theory that reframed the entire case overnight. Instead of a sympathetic victim, some began to see Denise as a fugitive, and the ominous fridge note as an elaborate cover story staged to throw investigators off her trail. In 1986, formal embezzlement charges were filed against her. 7 years later, those charges were dropped entirely, and for a while, her family allowed themselves to hope she might finally come forward on her own. Now that the legal risk of doing so had technically disappeared, that hope sat dormant for nearly 2 decades. Then, in 2002, a private investigator named Shirley Casey handed authorities a promising lead. A woman living in Florida who matched Denise's physical description and shared her exact date of birth. Almost 17 years after she vanished, law enforcement was back on her trail. On May 13, 2002, Denise was finally located in Panama City, Florida, now living under the name Denise James. She had quietly rebuilt an entire life and started a new family, all without her old relatives, or anyone else, having the faintest idea she was still alive. When she was finally confronted, Denise revealed the real reason she'd disappeared. Her employer had allegedly threatened to kill her within 2 days if she didn't leave. In a desperate bid to disappear completely and cover her tracks, She'd moved through the Bahamas, California, South Carolina, and Hawaii before finally settling into her new identity in Florida. It meant that the very same embezzlement accusations that once painted her as a criminal on the run were, according to Denise, actually connected to the reason she feared for her life in the first place. An inversion nobody investigating the case in 1985 had ever considered. With the mystery finally solved after 17 years, Denise was able to have an emotional, long overdue reunion with the family, who had spent almost 2 decades wondering whether she was alive, guilty, or gone forever. For her relatives, the years of uncertainty, not knowing if they should be grieving her or resenting her, finally gave way to something far simpler. Relief that she was alive, and answers for a mystery that had shadowed their family for the better part of 2 decades. Denise ran from a threat and stayed hidden for 17 years, and at least got the chance to explain herself in person once she was found. Our next case took over 5 decades to resolve, more than 3 times as long. And the truth, when it finally surfaced, completely rewrote what everyone thought they knew about why she left, and about the man who had lived under suspicion for the rest of his life because of it. Segment 4. Lucy Ann Johnson. Lucy Ann Johnson, born Lucy Ann Carriere on October 14, 1935, in Skagway, Alaska, spent her early years moving between small towns before her family eventually settled in the Yukon community of Carcross when she was 8 years old. A remote, close-knit community where everyone tended to know everyone else's business, which makes what happened later all the more strange. In 1953, she left Carcross, and from that point on, contact with her extended family became increasingly rare. The following year, Lucy met a man named Marvin Johnson. The two fell in love quickly and married soon after, relocating to Surrey, British Columbia. Lucy found work at a local hospital, while Marvin worked on a tugboat, a demanding, physically exhausting job that took a serious toll on him. Over time, he began drinking heavily to cope, and as his drinking worsened, so did his temper. Marvin became increasingly volatile, at times lashing out and even becoming physically abusive toward Lucy. From the outside, the Johnsons probably looked like any other young working-class family, raising 2 kids and getting by the best they could. Behind closed doors, though, Lucy was reportedly living with a level of fear that nobody outside that house fully understood. Their daughter, Linda, would later say she never witnessed outright violence from her father directly, but she strongly sensed that something abusive had been happening between her parents, the kind of tension a child picks up on without ever being told directly what's wrong. Then, in 1961, Lucy vanished without a trace. Strangely, Marvin didn't report her missing until 1965, a full 4 years after she disappeared. And even then, only after a concerned neighbor who hadn't seen Lucy in years tipped off the police. Think about that timeline for a moment. A mother of 2 young children simply gone, and her own husband apparently felt no urgency to tell a single authority for 4 straight years. That detail alone was enough to make investigators deeply suspicious of him from the very start. When officers questioned him, Marvin simply confirmed what the neighbor had already suspected. Lucy had been gone since 1961. Investigators initially suspected foul play, especially after a neighbor recalled seeing Marvin digging in his backyard around the time Lucy vanished. But a search of the property turned up nothing, leaving police without enough evidence to charge him with anything. DNA samples were collected from Lucy's children in case they were ever needed to identify unidentified remains, but no matches ever surfaced. As time went on, Marvin grew reluctant to even say Lucy's name. He eventually remarried and forbade his children, Linda and Daniel, from ever mentioning their mother again. Tragically, Lucy's son Daniel passed away in his late teens, never learning what became of his mother. Linda, despite losing her mother at just 7 years old, went on to build a full life of her own, marrying, raising a family, and eventually becoming a grandmother to 10 grandchildren, all while carrying an unanswered question about her mother that never fully went away, even decades later. Meanwhile, Lucy's disappearance became one of the longest-running unsolved cases in the history of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. A file that got dustier every year, reopened periodically whenever new forensic techniques became available, and closed again just as quietly when nothing new turned up. By 2013, Linda, now in her 50s, had largely made peace with the idea that her mother was gone for good. But before letting go entirely, she decided to try one last, unlikely approach. Knowing her mother had originally come from Alaska, Linda placed a classified ad in the Yukon News, including Lucy's full name, date of birth, birthplace, and her parents' names. A final long-shot attempt at closure. What happened next stunned her. A woman named Rhonda, living in Whitehorse, Yukon, was told by her brother about a strange ad someone had placed, searching for a mother who shared the exact same name and personal details as their own mother. Curious and more than a little unsettled, Rhonda reached out to Linda. The moment they began talking, a connection was undeniable. They were related. Linda immediately made arrangements for a long overdue trip. When she stepped off the plane in Whitehorse, she was greeted by a crowd of family members she never knew existed. A half-sister, a half-brother, and 2 aunts, all waiting eagerly to meet her just outside the airport's fenced area, practically vibrating with anticipation after decades of not knowing this side of the family even existed. Among them, no one was more overjoyed than Lucy herself, who instantly recognized her daughter despite more than 50 years apart. Proof, if nothing else, that whatever time and distance had taken from them, it hadn't erased the bond entirely. Lucy Ann Johnson was alive and well. After vanishing in 1961, she had remained in British Columbia until the 1980s, before relocating to the Yukon, remarrying and raising 4 more children. When she finally explained what had happened all those years ago, her story flipped the entire case on its head. Her disappearance hadn't been some dark, sinister act carried out against her. It had been an escape. She revealed that she had tried to take her children with her when she left, but Marvin refused to let them go, leaving her with an impossible choice between staying in a home she feared for her safety in, or leaving without the 2 children she loved. Her account effectively cleared her late ex-husband of any suspected involvement in her disappearance, replacing decades of quiet suspicion with a far more painful truth. Lucy had simply been running for her life from an abusive marriage and had been forced to leave her own children behind to do it, a decision she reportedly carried guilt over for the rest of her life, even after starting over completely. Even after learning all of this, Linda said she felt no anger toward her mother. Instead, she simply hoped for the chance to build a relationship, and that her own children and grandchildren would eventually be welcomed into the family Lucy had spent the last 50 years building without her. Lucy's family got a joyful, if bittersweet, reunion after 52 years. Our final case tonight doesn't end quite so happily, because by the time the truth finally came out, 44 years had already passed, and it was far too late for a reunion at all. Segment 5, Tamara Milograd's. On September 18, 1971, 15-year-old Tamara Milograd's and 2 of her closest friends set off for the Royal Melbourne Show, an enormous annual carnival in Melbourne, Australia, that drew hundreds of thousands of visitors every year, the kind of event an entire city looked forward to, and the last place anyone would expect a teenager to vanish in broad daylight, surrounded by friends. When Tamara told her mother, Rubel, about the trip, Rubel, hearing how massive the crowds would be, offered to come along to keep an eye on the girls. Tamara firmly refused, insisting she and her friends could look out for each other. After a quick goodbye, she left with her friends for what was supposed to be an exciting day out. The group spent the day taking in everything the show had to offer: sheep shearing demonstrations, horse races, alpaca displays, and wood chopping competitions, all set against the noise and chaos of hundreds of thousands of fairgoers packed into the showground. Tamara had reportedly seemed unusually withdrawn and uneasy for most of the day, quieter than her friends were used to. At some point, she told them she needed to step away to find somewhere to exchange some money since she'd run out of cash. She promised to be back shortly. She never returned. As the minutes stretched into hours, panic set in. Her friends searched everywhere they could think of, with no luck, and were eventually forced to call Tamara's family. Her parents rushed to the showground immediately, and after hours of searching turned up nothing, they alerted the police. Despite an expanded search of the surrounding area, there was no trace of 15-year-old Tamara anywhere. As investigators dug into her home life, a more complicated picture emerged. Tamara had been going through a turbulent, rebellious phase, introverted, frequently skipping school, and locked in escalating tension with her family. She had run away once before, disappearing through her bedroom window for several days before eventually coming home on her own. Friends told police that shortly before she vanished for good, Tamara had a heated argument with her family over her boyfriend and had since been talking more and more about running away for good and starting a completely new life somewhere else. In the weeks that followed, scattered reports trickled in, witnesses who claimed to have seen Tamara hiding near the showground stables for a couple of days after she disappeared, rumors that she'd taken a job at a bar near the waterfront in St. Kilda, and a claimed sighting by a friend at a hotel elsewhere in the city. Each new tip sent investigators chasing another dead end, arriving just late enough or vague enough that nothing could ever be confirmed. None of it led anywhere concrete, but combined with her troubled home life, it was enough to convince investigators that Tamara had most likely left of her own free will. Her family refused to accept that as the end of the story. They hired a private investigator and personally traveled to every location where she was rumored to have been spotted. The stables, the bar in St. Kilda, the hotel where she was supposedly seen, only to come back empty-handed every single time, chasing a trail that always seemed to go cold just as it started to feel promising. Year after year, the case grew colder, but her parents never stopped hoping she would eventually come home, holding on to her old bedroom and her belongings long after most people would have given up. Tragically, after 18 years of waiting for answers that never came, Tamara's father passed away without ever learning what had happened to his daughter, carrying the uncertainty with him to his grave. In 2010, Melbourne launched a Missing Persons Week initiative, and Tamara's case was one of the stories featured to the public in hopes of generating new leads. 5 years later, in 2015, a woman named Karina Russell was browsing the Australian Federal Police's Missing Persons website when a photograph stopped her cold. A woman who looked remarkably like her own mother. Karina's mother had died in a car accident years earlier, when Karina was still a small child, leaving her with only fragments of memory and a lifetime of unanswered questions about who her mother really was. But growing up, Karina had slowly uncovered strange gaps in her mother's history, including the unsettling discovery that her parents had never actually been legally married, and that her mother had never been able to produce a birth certificate, something that always struck Karina as odd but never explainable. That nagging curiosity followed her well into adulthood. The similarities between the woman in the missing persons photo and the mother she remembered, right down to a shared birth date and an uncanny physical resemblance, were too strong to ignore. Karina contacted Australia's National Missing Persons Coordination Centre, unaware that what she was about to uncover would completely rewrite her understanding of who her mother really was. To confirm whether the woman in the photo, listed under the name Pauline Tammy Russell, was truly the long-missing Tamara Milogradz, investigators reached out to Tamara's biological family and collected a DNA sample from one of her siblings. Experts at the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine confirmed the match. After 44 years of not knowing, Tamara's family finally had their answer. The truth was devastating in its own quiet way. After running away in 1971, Tamara had cut all ties with her old life, moved elsewhere in Victoria, changed her age to 18, and rebuilt herself entirely under the name Pauline Tammy Russell. She married, had 2 children, one of them Karina, and for a while lived the completely different life she'd once told her friends she was dreaming of. But that new life ended just as abruptly as her old one. Tamara died in a car crash years later, long before her biological family ever learned what had become of her. There was no joyful airport reunion waiting at the end of this one. Tamara's parents never got their answer while they were alive, and the sister and brother, who spent decades hoping for a phone call that would bring her home, instead got a DNA report confirming she had already been gone for years. But her surviving family finally got the one thing they'd been chasing for over 4 decades: the truth. And in the process, they gained something they never expected, a new branch of family they never knew existed, including Karina, who was welcomed into the fold with open arms, carrying a piece of the mother none of them had truly gotten to say goodbye to. In a strange way, Tamara's own daughter became the closest thing her birth family would ever get to seeing her again. Outrow 5 children, 5 families torn apart in completely different ways. A son who found out his loving father was also his kidnapper. A newborn stolen from a hospital bassinet, raised for 18 years under a stranger's name. A woman who vanished under threat and quietly rebuilt her life under a new identity. A mother who 50 years later turned out to be running from abuse, not towards some dark secret. And a teenage girl whose new life, and whose truth, only reached her original family decades after she was already gone. What ties every one of these cases together isn't just the disappearance, it's the aftermath. The children who grew up not knowing who they really were. The parents who spent decades not knowing if hope was even worth holding on to. And the uncomfortable reminder that sometimes the truth doesn't bring the closure we expect it to. Sometimes it brings more grief. Sometimes it brings a whole new family you never knew you had. And sometimes, like with Tamara, it simply confirms what everyone feared, decades after it could have changed anything. If these stories hit you as hard as they hit us, make sure you're subscribed, because there are more cases just like these coming soon. And if you had to pick just one, we're genuinely curious. Was it Julian's conflicted loyalty to his father, Kamaya's impossible choice between 2 mothers, or Tamara's family finally getting an answer decades too late? Let us know in the comments which one of these 5 stories affected you the most. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.